I've said it before, I'll say it again, never before, I think in the history of my life, and as we've stepped into these last days, do we need to know how to hear the voice of the Lord. That's where the church is. If you're part of the church of Jesus Christ, then we have got to learn how to hear his voice. We have got to learn to put ourselves in position where we're listening to the Spirit. Because there are so many voices and so many opinions and so many places you can go to hear. One day you'll hear one thing, and then the next day you hear from another source, and it'll be the exact opposite. And you're going to need to know what is truth. You're going to need to know to look at it and see it and read one thing one day and one thing another, and you're going to have to know what to do and how to walk in it. Otherwise, you'll be confused, and there'll be chaos, and there'll be those things in your life that are leading you in one direction one day and in another direction another day. And unless you learn to sit back and be still and listen to his voice, you'll be all over the map. There are so many voices that are hollering. Culture today and society today says, do this, go this way, follow this, and you'll be okay, or do this and you'll be accepted. And we've got to learn how to hear his voice. And so this morning I'm asking you a question that each one of us has to answer for ourselves. I cannot answer it for you. You cannot answer it for your spouse or anybody beside you. You have to answer for yourself. Are you listening? Are you hearing the voice of God? Now, there are segments of this society, and there are places even in our culture that will say, if you're hearing the voice of God, then you're nuts. You're crazy. You've lost it. But I'm going to stand here to tell you, if you know truth and hear truth, you will hear the voice of God. Because Jesus himself said, I'm the shepherd, and my sheep will hear my voice. He's still speaking today. Don't let anybody rob you and tell you different. Don't let anybody speak to you and say, God doesn't speak anymore. If you're hearing him, you don't know. How can you hear the voice of God? Yes, you can. I want to take you to the Old Testament. I want to show you a neat little story. Some of you know this story. It comes from 1 Samuel. Samuel was a little boy. He was being mentored by this priest named Eli. And in those days, when you were being mentored, in this case by a priest, Samuel moved into the tabernacle, and he moved into the place to learn under the priest, Eli. And we pick it up in chapter 3, verse 1. Samuel served the Lord by assisting Eli. Now in those days, the messages from the Lord were very rare, and visions were quite uncommon. And for whatever reason, there was a period of time where it seemed God was silent. He didn't speak very much. You couldn't hear his voice, and people didn't have visions about what he was doing, what he wanted to do. One night, Eli, who was almost blind, had gone to bed. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Samuel was sleeping near the Ark of the Covenant. All of a sudden, he heard, Samuel. Samuel, well, yes. And he ran. What is it? He ran to Eli and said, Eli, what do you want? Here I am. Did you call me? I didn't call you, Eli said. Go back to bed. So Samuel went back to bed. A little while later, same thing happened. Samuel. Again, Samuel jumped up and ran to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? What do you need? I'm sure Eli, kind of half asleep. I didn't call you. Go back to bed. I mean, he's kind of like, come on, kid. Get this now. Look what it says. Samuel did not yet know the Lord because he had never heard a message from him. He had never had an encounter with him. He hadn't put himself in the position to hear, so he had never heard the voice of the Lord, so he didn't recognize it. Do you see the analogy for today? Samuel could not recognize the voice of the Lord because he had never heard it. Some of you today have never heard the voice of the Lord because you don't recognize him. He's speaking. So another time, the Lord called out a third time, Samuel. So he got up, ran to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? It finally dawned on Eli what was happening, and he told the boy, listen, if this voice calls out again, I want you to answer it and say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went back to bed. So guess what? Fourth time, the Lord came. Samuel, Samuel. And then Samuel replied, speak. Your servant is listening. And he got to hear the voice of the Lord. And it propelled him in to being the prophet that Samuel was. Because he had an encounter with the Lord, he heard the Lord, and he began to discover the Lord's voice. Apart from all the other voices that were speaking around him. He had to learn to hear the one true voice. Are you listening? I want to show you something from James chapter 1. I love how James put this because we've all been there. Some of you are right there right now. You're in the middle of it, and if not, you might be someday. Look what it says, if you need wisdom. In other words, if you have something you don't know how to answer, or if you have a question you're not sure what to do, or a situation you're not sure where to go to or how to do it, or whatever it is, if you need wisdom, if you need to make a choice and a decision and you're not sure what to do, this is what he says. James is saying, ask our generous God. And now here's something that sometimes we just gloss over, or we read it and we take it for granted, but we don't let it sink in and let it deposit something in your heart and your spirit. Look what it says next. And what? He will give it to you. Do you see it? If you need wisdom, but you don't know what to do, if you don't know about a situation in your life, you don't know about the situation, should I date that person? Should I marry that person? Should I buy that house? Should I change that job? Should whatever it is in your life that you're facing right now and you says, I just do not know. The issue and the problem is too many times is we do the age-old thing is we get a piece of paper and we start putting down, here's all the positives and here's the negatives, and we say, if the positives outweigh the negatives, that's what I'm going to do. That could be the furthest thing from the truth, and it can get you in so much problems. Because oftentimes there can be a whole page of positives and none on the negatives, and God says, no, that's not what I want from you. And the opposite can be, you can look at a situation and it could be all negative and no positive, and God said, that's what I want you to do. And you're like, huh? Because you have to learn to listen to his voice. He knows the beginning from the end. He knows what's coming. He knows what's down the road. He knows what's next in your life, and you cannot see it. We have to trust his voice. Look what it says. If you need wisdom, ask, and he will give it to you. In other words, it's implying that he is going to speak to you. He's going to reveal it to you. What you need, when you need it, and at the time you need it. He will not rebuke you. He will not get mad at you. He will not get angry at you for asking. How many times did he have to go to Samuel? Samuel, Samuel, Samuel. You know, if it was us natural, our voice would be raising higher. Samuel! And God was just kind of gentle, and he's always just kind of compassionate, and he's long-suffering. And finally, because Samuel had never heard his voice. If you're here this morning and you've never heard his voice, but you have the Spirit of God in you, your inheritance says you can hear him. It's your right. It's your ability to hear him. It's there for you. It's already been done. It's within you. It's deposited within you to hear his voice. Now, I have a question. Are you listening? And if I had to ask you and came to you face to face and look at you and said, have you ever heard the voice of God? Your answer probably should be, yeah. Not to make it up, but if you have not heard the voice of God, then I have to question, are you listening? Because he's speaking. Verse 6, he says, but when you ask him, now here's some parameters he's putting on, here's some boundaries. But when you ask, and he wants you to ask, and you know he's going to give to you, what does he say? Be sure that your faith is in faith in who? In God alone. That's what he's saying. He's saying, listen, there's a lot of different sources. You can go to Wikipedia. You can go to Google, you can go to YouTube, you can go to a lot of places, and you'll get a lot of sources and you'll get a lot of information, and we're all over the map, and you can get a source, it's very trustworthy over here, and then you can go to another source that's just as trustworthy, and it can be the exact same opposite. Where are you going to go and who are you going to listen to? That's what he's saying. Be sure that your faith is in God alone. Why? Look what it says next. Do not waver For a person with divided loyalty is unsettled as a wave of the sea. It's blown and tossed about. That's where so many people, unfortunately, are here now in the body of Christ. They're being blown all over the place by a lot of different questions. What's in the forefront in our society today? Mask, no mask. Jab, no jab. Do this, don't do that. Go here, don't go there. You can do this, you can't do that. On and on and on and on. And we have society that's being divided. We're having, even within the church, it's being divided. The enemy's done a great job of dividing us because we're not listening to the one true source. We're listening to a lot of other sources, and we're being tossed back and forth, and we're not sure what to do and how to do it and go this way. He says such people, these people who are looking at other sources than God alone, should not expect to receive anything. Here's where so many people are. Here's the answer. If you're sitting here today and you said, I've never heard the voice of God, I've been in church all my life, or I have the Spirit, I've been a Christian for so long, I've never heard his voice. Here's one of the reasons why. Because you're going back and forth. You should not expect to receive anything from him or to hear from him if you're all over the map and you're just not relying on him and trusting him. He's the source. Put your faith in him and him alone. He says, don't let your loyalty be divided between God and the opinions of this world, between God and man, between God and what any social media says, any news outlet says. If you're a CNN person, don't put your trust in that. If you're a Fox person, don't put your trust in that. There's one and one alone. So what do? I'm going to wrap it up this morning, just give you some helpful hints. Very simple, everyday, common sense ways that we can begin to hear his voice. First one is simply what? Say ask. That's where it starts, right? If you don't open your mouth, nothing's going to get done. You got to begin to ask. Philippians 4, what does it say? Paul's saying don't worry about anything, right? If you have anxiety, if there's things in your life that are creating, if there's stuff that's happening, stop. Don't worry about it. But we're instead supposed to do what? Pray about everything. See, we've done the opposite. We've worried about it. We've talked about it. We've written about it. We've blogged about it. We've posted about it. We've Snapchatted about it. We've Insta-chatted about it. We've all these chaps and all these things you can't even pronounce anymore. We've done it all. I bet people are still confused and they don't know. Stop and start praying. Get in your closet. Get at home. Shut the door. Say, God, I'm really confused. God, I'm all over the map. I just need to hear from you. I need to start praying about it. And tell God what you need. Ask him. And thank him for what he's done. Okay, we got to learn to ask. There's a second part that goes along with asking. We need to learn to listen. We need to put ourselves in a position to listen. We need to turn off the noise. We need to turn off the music. We need to turn down all the things that distract us and grab our attention, and all the entertainment sometimes that takes us in different places and occupies our time. And we've got to learn to listen. Put yourself in a place to listen. Period. No excuses. Ask. Listen. Now it's getting a little more difficult. Look what it says. Expect him to speak. Isn't that what the word says? Isn't that what James said? James said, when you ask, he will what? Give it to you. Right? So expect him to speak. You see, that's where a lot of people go, it goes south for them. A lot of people don't mind asking. They can ask. They pray, they pray, they pray, they pray. Some people then, maybe stop and listen for a while, but they don't expect him to say anything. Then a week later, and a month later, or somewhere they're asked, well, what's God saying about it? I don't know. It's like he doesn't speak to me. He speaks to that guy. He speaks to her. That person's always hearing from something from God, but I'm never hearing anything. Well, do you expect him to speak to you? And finally, here's the fourth one. And it can be some of the toughest thing to do. You got to act on it. You got to start doing it. You got to put it into action. You got to put it into place. You got to go do it. Now, I admit it's much easier if somebody else tells me what God is saying for me. Isn't that easier? Isn't it easier to go to somebody, hey, what's God saying to you for me? That's a lot easier. Because then I'm never wrong. They're wrong if they mess it up. It's like, well, I didn't hear that. That person told me that I was supposed to do that. They told me I was supposed to sell my car and buy this car, and now this car broke down. That's their fault. Huh? But that's what we love. We love to let somebody else hear from God for you. Whoa. Now, there are times I can hear something for you. There are times I do hear things for you because that's where I put myself in that position, and I have that gifting of the prophetic, and so sometimes that works. But listen, you can hear God every bit as much as I can. Don't buy the lie. Well, he's up front, he's got the microphone, he's got that gift. No, you have the ability to hear God for yourself just as much as I do. Maybe the reason you don't is because you're not practicing and taking the time and listening. And you know, I confess this, 20 years ago when we started the church, one of the things we planned to do from the very beginning is teach people how to listen from God. And that can be one of the most dangerous things, right? I've heard people come up to me and say, I think God's telling me this. And I'm like, in my heart, I'm like, I don't think that's God. But how do you argue with that, right? I mean, because you're teaching people how to listen for God, and then when people say they heard from God, the worst thing you're going to do is go, that ain't God. I mean, they got to hear that from themselves, right? They got to learn through themselves. They got to, succeed and fail sometimes in themselves. I mean, there's wise counsel. Proverbs says, build wise counsel around you. When you make a decision, go ahead and listen to other people. But then ultimately it comes back to you and God. What's God saying? Act on what you hear. Put it into practice. Go for it. God is gracious and compassionate and long-suffering, and so many people, I think, are afraid to fail. I don't think God's concerned about your failure. I think he's more concerned about your obedience. The worst thing we can do is not be obedient and do it because we're afraid we're going to fail. Not doing it is failure. Knowing what is right and not doing it is called sin. So where are we today? Well, the question is are you listening? Are you listening? Are you hearing his voice? Because I'll tell you what, the place where we're finding ourselves in society, you better be hearing his voice. Because it's not going to get any better. The decisions you're going to have to make as a family, the decisions you're going to have to make with your children, the decisions you have to make about jobs, the decisions you have to make that cost you. There's some people right here now that I know are wrestling with, you're at a place and your job is requiring you maybe to get this vaccine and do this, and there may soon be vaccine passports and you can't go certain places. Listen, all of those things are all part of society. It's not taking God by surprise. He's not up there wringing his hands, oh, what's going to happen? Do you know what he's doing? He's saying, I have a way, I have a plan. To those who are willing to listen to me, I'll reveal it to them. So you're sitting there going like, I don't know what to do. Do I do it? Ask, listen, expect him to speak. And when you hear his voice, go do it. You can't go wrong. I'm not saying it won't lead you into trouble because, listen, I heard somewhere along the line that Jesus said, the world hates me, and if you follow me, they're going to hate you too. So there's going to be some trouble. If you think you're going to get out of trouble, then you better go buy a little cabin in the woods and go up there and hoard all your food and just stay there for the next 20 or 30 years. That's the only way out of it. And that ain't going to help because you have to live with yourself. And some of you aren't very nice in your head. Ask, listen, expect, and go do it. Adam, come on up. We'll do a final song. I want to share this a story, and I've shared it before over the years. This is a great analogy because it's happened to me. A number of years ago, I was driving down by Selinsgrove. I was going on a back road, and I was going past the church, and all of a sudden I heard the voice of the Lord. And again, it's not an audible voice. It was in my spirit. I'm like, I want you to stop and give a word to the pastor of that church. And I was driving along like, Don't know the pastor of that church. Never met the pastor of that church. I don't think that's you, God. And so I kept on going. I was like, I want you to stop, turn around, give a word to, I'm like, So, I'm like, okay. So I turned around, went back, pulled into the church. And of course, in my mind, I'm like, well, surely he's not in his office. My mind is, I hope he's not in his office. So I get out, I went, knocked on it. Guess what? He was in his office. So I opened him up, I went in, introduced myself, and I sat down and said, now this may sound strange to you. And I usually don't introduce myself as a pastor because, I don't, okay? But I introduced just so he would know I'm not a flake, and he might have thought I was anyway. I said, I think I have a word from God for you. And you could tell in his face, it wasn't necessarily something that he was used to, but he said, okay. So he sat down, and it was a short word. I don't even hardly remember what it was. And it was just like, there it is. And he's like, oh, thank you. I don't think it was, I get up and I left because I never knew him. He thanked me, I thanked him. I get in my car, I'm like, okay? Because I was like, well, I don't know. But all it was is about me being obedient. I don't know if it transformed his life. I don't know today if he remembers that. And 20 years later, or however many years, he might be somewhere preaching. He'd be like, I remember a day this crazy man stopped in my office and gave me a word from the Lord. That could be real. I don't know. All I know is I heard, I listened, and I needed to act on it. It wasn't up to me whether he received it or not, or it was some great transformational word. I just know what I was supposed to do. That's what the Holy Spirit wants to do for each of us. He has a word to release from you. He has a word to release from you to your spouse. He has a word to release for your children. He has a word to release in your workplace. He has a word to release for somebody. From your heart, from his heart, through your heart to somebody else. When you're in Walmart or when you're in the IGA or wherever you're at, he has something he wants to speak to you about that will affect somebody else, will influence somebody else, and he's going to use you. He wants to partner with you, but only if we're listening, only if we're willing to say, I'm hearing. And then the hardest part sometimes opening our mouth, right? Because we're like, oh, well, I messed this up. What will they think of me? Who cares? Just do it. What if I'm wrong? Yeah, I've been wrong so many times I don't even count anymore. That's why I have grace. God says, come on, keep going. You'll get it. Listen to his voice. Janie's going to come. She'll share it as she does. I'll just share this. Years ago, remember in the old days, Janie would remember this, not that she's old, but older. We had these things called telephones. Remember them on the wall? Yeah. And some of them even had those little, things that, yeah. And then they get this great invention that you could push a button on the walls and something. But the neat thing was, when the phone rang, it was a surprise because you never knew who was calling, right? I mean, you did. There was no caller ID. It was like, oh, who could be calling me? So, but the thing is, when you picked it up, if it was somebody that you knew, you instantly recognized their voice, right? If your spouse was away and they called you, you didn't have to go, hi, I'm your wife. I think you automatically knew why, because of your voice, right? Now listen carefully. The Holy Spirit in you, when he's speaking, should get to the point in your life where you instantly recognize his voice. Just like you recognize your best friend or your children or your spouse. When the Spirit speaks, you go, that's the Holy Spirit. You shouldn't have to, you get it? Go for it.
I got it.
It's on.
Okay. Yeah, I'm at number 4. And it's so interesting how this worked because we were in the first service, my husband and I, and God brought to my mind probably the most profound time that I heard his voice. And I said yes, and I'll share that in a minute. And so then I started. Why did this come to my mind? Am I supposed to share this? Many people have already heard it. Do I need to say it again? So I'm asking, and then I'm listening, and I'm like trying to find somebody else to tell me to do it, right? And then somebody came in the sanctuary this morning, and I've been praying about this ever since, and this young woman said, I'm tired of giving the enemy giving in to the enemy. I'm like, okay, I heard that. And then as we sat down and we were worshiping, I'm looking at the back of someone else, and I'm remembering that I've asked her to give her testimony. And I'm like, oh, why would I ask her to do something that I'm not willing to do? Okay, so now I'm listening, right? And I'm expecting to hear, and I heard. And then number 4, act on what you hear. So that's why I'm here, because I am acting on what I heard God tell me to share. So what I want to share with you is the time that I heard very clearly, more clearly than I've ever heard before in my life, and I said yes. And it was before I knew I could even hear God's voice, but I knew it was him. I woke up in the middle of the night, literally, and heard God say, set my people free. And I sat straight up in bed, and without even hesitating, I said yes, but I don't know what that means. I kind of talked freely to God, too. I said, you're going to have to open doors, close doors, because I don't have a clue what you're talking about. But yes. So I laid down, went back to sleep, and I literally did not give it another thought. I didn't try to make something happen. I didn't push anything. I didn't do anything with it, other than I said yes that night. So now we have to fast forward, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. Gene and I are elders here at the church, and we're in a meeting, and Pastor Allen said we're soon going to have somebody start a freedom ministry around here, and my hand went up, and then it went down quickly because around here we have to pray first, right? So, but it was in my prayers. When I was praying that I remembered the night that I said yes, and I knew immediately what I had to do. I had my own business for about 20 years, and I knew I'd have to give that up and do it pretty quickly. Meant a lot of changes in my life to do it, but I knew I had to do it. So I said yes, and gave me a little office and painted it and sat down and said, God, here I am, because I don't know anything. And I didn't. I absolutely knew nothing, but he's taken it and he's developed it into a ministry, and he's developed me, and he's grown me, and he's healed me, and it's just taken me through a whole transformation of my own life. And so I guess the bottom line is, are you listening? And when you hear, say yes, and see what it will do in your life.
Thanks, Shannon. You can take that with you. As we get ready to close, if you stand to your feet, I want to extend, I guess, an invitation for you this morning to respond to the word today. And as we begin to do this next song, as we get into the worship, I want to invite you to come. And if you're struggling listening, or listening hasn't been a part of your routine, or you don't even know you can listen, or you're at that point, I just want you to come up here and make your way and just spend a few minutes up here just praying, and then I want to pray over you, okay? It's not going to be a big deal. It's not going to be, one of those, it may be a supernatural thing to you, but I just want you to respond to it. I'm going to say, Lord, I haven't been hearing your voice. I recognize today that I need to. It's part of my right as a child of God. I've struggled with it because I'm not sure. Do I hear right? Is it you? Is it not you? Is it the pizza I ate last night? All of those things we go through, right? And all those struggles, they're real. Been there, done that. We want to break that off of you and set you free. Because listen, there's a whole world out there that needs to be influenced and affected by the body of Christ, by you. And he's just waiting for your yes. He's waiting for you to hear his voice. And there's some of you people here today, and there's some that are probably watching because you didn't make it this morning, that there's a number of you in here that you have known for a period of time that you're supposed to do something. Some of you are supposed to be small group leaders, and you've refused in the last year or two, and the Lord is, I want to be careful because I don't want to speak out of turn for the Lord. I don't want to, sometimes the Lord can continually ask and ask and ask, and if you continually say no and no and no, there comes a time where I think he goes, who's next? It's not that he doesn't love you, he's just, you refuse to be obedient. He says, well, I'll take the next person. They may not be ready, but man, they're willing. And you might be sitting there going like, I don't know enough, If you hear the yes, you do it. If you hear it, you do it. It may not happen overnight, but you're willing to say, I'm willing to. Some of you need to be in the prayer ministry. Some of you are prayer people. Some of you are people of prayer that you love to pray, and you're intercessors. It's time you get connected to the prayer ministry and the prayer team. It's not you can't pray at home. But you need to get connected because it'll unleash you and it'll take you to a whole other place. And I just suspect, now here I'm going out on a limb there, there's just a person or two in here that's kind of a church planter type person that maybe it's time for you to look at planting a church. How can I, if that's what you're hearing, just say yes. Whatever it is. You say, that's scary. Yeah, been there. Doesn't get any easier. There's just more joy in it. So as we do this last song, I want to invite you, just make it a moment, make it a time. You just say yes. And I want to pray over you at the end, just to release your ability to hear him clear, crystal clear, more than you ever have before. There'll still be that struggle. There'll still be that enemy whispering, no, no, no. But as you say yes, 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 some will happen. Okay? So come on, as we begin to pray.